we are going to talk about converse, inverse, and contrapositive. If we begin with a statement in the if-then form, known as an implication or conditional statement, P implies Q, otherwise read if P, then Q. Then the converse of that statement would be to swap the P and Q and write Q implies P, sometimes stated as if Q, then P. The inverse would be to keep the P and Q in their same order, but to do their opposites. If not P, then not Q, or sometimes read as not P implies not Q. These two are equivalent to one another. If we do the contrapositive, the P and Q switch places and become their opposites. So if P implies Q to become not Q implies not P. Or sometimes read if not Q, then not P. These two right here are equivalent statements. So we have that the contrapositive is the only statement that is equivalent to the original. The converse and the inverse are equivalent to one another, and notice that the inverse is the contrapositive of the converse. Because if I started with Q implies P, swapping both sides and doing their opposites would give me not P implies not Q. So let's work out some examples here. Our first example is if it rains, then the laundry gets wet. So let's choose some letters to describe this. Let's say if it rains, then the laundry gets wet. So the converse would be to switch these. Switch the letters. The inverse would be to keep them in their same order, but to go to their opposites. And the contrapositive would be to switch both. So the W would come to the front, but would become the opposite. So the converse becomes if the laundry gets wet, then it rains. The inverse becomes if it doesn't rain, then the laundry doesn't get wet. Contrapositive becomes if the laundry doesn't get wet, then it doesn't rain. So we have switched the order of them. Okay, let's look at the second example. If it rains, then the crops don't die. So we're starting out with a negative. The rain, if it does rain, the crops don't die. So we'll say not D and let D represent dying, so that not D is not dying. So the converse is just going to reverse them. So not D is going to imply R. The inverse would be to keep the R first, but to make it a not R. Keep the D second, but it was a not D, so now it's going to become a D. The contrapositive is to swap their positions and make them their opposites. So D would become not R. So the converse will be if the crops don't die, then it rains. The inverse will become if it doesn't rain, then the crops die. And notice that the converse and inverse aren't necessarily the same as the original. They both, possible they're both true, but they don't mean the same thing. The contrapositive does mean the same thing as the original. If it rains and the crops don't die. If the crops die, then it doesn't rain. Because they didn't, then it would have rained. All right. Let's look at one with 3 negatives. Well, 2 negatives. Leave this one. 2 statements put together with the if then. So here I'm saying if it doesn't rain, then the picnic isn't postponed. The converse would be just switching those to put the not P in the front and then the not R. The inverse would leave the R and P first and second, but the nots would be gone because the opposite of not is something. The contrapositive would swap them and do their opposites. So that would turn them P to R. So the converse would be if the picnic isn't postponed, then it doesn't rain. The inverse would be if it rains, then the picnic is postponed. And those two are the same as each other, but not the same as the original statement. The contrapositive, if the picnic is postponed, it rains. That statement is equivalent to the original statement. Okay, let's look at one last example, a little more involved because it's going to have ands and ors, which means we are going to have to use DeMorgan's law when we do the opposite. So let's say if I practice and I don't panic, we can't use another P. So you've already used P, so let's call that one C. So if I practice and don't panic, then I will make a goal and not gain a foul. So let's make a goal or not gain a foul. Okay, so we do the converse, we're literally just going to switch. So the M or not G that's after the implication will come before it, and the P and not C that was before it will now come after it. Now for the inverse, we've got to do the opposite of P and not C. The opposite of P and not C is not P or C. So the opposite of P, the and changes to an or, and the not C. The M or not G becomes not M and G. The M becomes not M, the or changes to an and the not G becomes G. The contrapositive, we have to switch places and do the opposite. So the M or not G comes to the front, but becomes not M and G. The P and not C goes to the end, but becomes its opposite, not P or C. All right, so let's write out the sentence for the converse. So if I will make a goal, not gain a foul, then I practice and don't panic. Let's do the inverse. which would be changing that to the opposite. If I don't practice or do panic, you might not have to put the word do, then I will not make a goal and will gain a foul. All right, and to do the contrapositive, the one that is the same as the original. If I will not make a goal and will gain a foul, then I don't practice or do panic. So that's the way we find the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive of an implication or conditional statement. And again, remember that the original statement is equivalent to the contrapositive only, and that the converse and inverse are equivalent to one another.